In the middle of the 15th century, when Europe prayed behind crumbling walls and Asia dreamed of empire, one young ruler dared to do what 1,000 years of kings had failed to achieve. His name was Mehmed, the second of his line, the man history would remember as Mehmed the Conqueror. At just 19, he looked toward a city that stood as the spiritual and political heart of an entire civilization, Constantinople, and swore he would take it. Not for gold, not for vengeance, but to etch his name beside Alexander, Caesar, and every legend who had bent history to his will. What followed was not merely a siege, but a calculated symphony of ambition and fear. Cannons thundered like never before, walls that had defied centuries began to crumble, and the world watched as east and west collided in fire and steel. Yet behind the legend of conquest lies a darker question. What must a man become to reshape the world? Was Mehmed a visionary who forged the modern era, or a tyrant who drowned civilizations to build his empire? Tonight, we peel back the layers of myth and terror to uncover the man behind the crown, the strategist, the reformer, the killer, and the dreamer, whose decisions would change religion, trade, and geopolitics for centuries to come. This is not just the story of a city that fell. It's the story of how one man's will redefine the world itself. In the middle of the 15th century, the world stood divided between faiths, empires, and the fading glow of the medieval age. Europe prayed for deliverance behind stone walls that were centuries old, while the East dreamed of dominion stretching from desert to sea. Out of this tension rose a young ruler whose ambition would eclipse that of his forebears, Mehmed II, the man who would one day be called the Conqueror. He was not born into peace. The Ottoman Empire, though powerful, was not yet unshakable. His father, Mehmed II, had spent much of his reign balancing between wars with Christian kingdoms, rebellions from within, and the volatile politics of succession. Ottoman tradition, brutal and pragmatic, demanded that only one son could inherit the throne, and that all rivals, even brothers, must be eliminated to prevent civil war. Power was not passed gently. It was seized and defended with blood. Mehmed was born into this law of survival. From a young age, he was taught languages, Arabic, Persian, Greek, Latin, but also taught suspicion. Tutors drilled into him the art of war and the philosophy of empire. Even as a boy, he was fascinated by Alexander the Great, by Caesar, and by the legendary city that had resisted every conqueror before him, Constantinople, the ancient capital of the Roman East. When his father abdicated in 1444, hoping to retire to religious life, the 12-year-old Mehmed briefly became Sultan. But the empire's enemies, sensing weakness, moved swiftly. The Christian armies of Hungary, Poland, and Venice united in a crusade, sweeping down the Balkans. Within months, Murad was forced out of retirement. He took back the throne and crushed the Crusaders at Varna, a victory that would be remembered for centuries, and a lesson the boy Sultan would never forget. Mercy was a liability, and weakness invited ruin. From that moment, Mehmed's worldview hardened. He saw his father's brief attempt at peace as naive, a momentary hesitation that could have cost the empire its survival. When Murad finally died in 1451, Mehmed was no longer a child. At 19, he ascended the throne once more, and this time, he was determined to rule without compromise. The empire he inherited was strong but uneasy. To the west, the remnants of the Byzantine Empire still clung to life in Constantinople, a relic, but one that symbolically undermined Ottoman authority. To the east, rival Turkish beyliks waited for signs of instability. Inside his court, old advisors loyal to his father doubted the young sultan's resolve. One of them, the Grand Vizier Sandal Halil Pasha, openly mocked his ambitions, calling him a boy chasing impossible dreams. Mehmed listened and remembered. He understood that every empire had two kinds of enemies, those outside its walls and those sitting quietly within. His first act as sultan was not a coronation, but a purge. He dismissed or reassigned many of his father's ministers, replacing them with men of his own choosing, scholars, soldiers, and engineers who believed in the same vision he did. Among them was Zaganos Pasha, a reformist and military strategist who encouraged the sultan's dream of seizing Constantinople. But before Mehmed could march on the city, he had to secure his throne. His father had left behind another son, a baby, just a few weeks old. Under Ottoman law, the child represented a threat, however small. And so, with chilling calm, Mehmed gave the order that would define his rule. The infant was to be drowned in a bath, quietly, without spectacle. There was no anger in the act, no vengeance. It was pure calculation, an act of policy. To his people, it was proof of strength. To his enemies, it was a warning. And to history, it was the birth of a legend cloaked in both awe and fear. With his position secure, Mehmed turned to his obsession, the conquest of Constantinople. For more than 1,000 years, the city had been unconquered. Its triple walls had survived sieges by Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Crusaders, and even his own ancestors. To the Christian world, it was the last bastion of empire. To Mehmed, it was the key to immortality. He began his preparations in secret, disguising his true intentions behind diplomacy and construction projects. On the European side of the Bosphorus Strait, he ordered the building of a massive fortress, Rumeil-i-Haiza, the fortress of the Roman land. It rose in just 4 months, its towers positioned to control every ship that passed through the strait. It was, in every sense, a declaration of war carved in stone. The Byzantines protested, but their words carried little weight. The Sultan sent a polite reply assuring them the fortress was merely for defense, and then ordered his gunners to fire on the first Venetian ship that refused to pay passage. The crew was executed, their captain impaled as a warning to all who approached without Ottoman permission. Fear, Mehmed had learned, was a more reliable diplomat than promises. Inside the empire, he worked to unify and modernize his forces. He reformed the Janissaries, the elite infantry corps drawn from Christian boys converted through the Divserm system, turning them into one of the most disciplined armies in the world. He invested in artillery, hiring engineers from across Europe to design supercannons capable of breaching any wall. Among them was Orban, a Hungarian master of metallurgy who had once offered his services to the Byzantines, only to be rejected for lack of funds. Mehmed gave him everything he asked for: gold, labor, and the promise of eternal fame. By 1452, the pieces were in place. Trade along the Bosphorus slowed to a trickle. Ottoman soldiers drilled daily in the plains of Thrace. Caravans of oxen dragged enormous bronze cannons across the countryside. From his palace, Mehmed watched, planning every step. To his court, he spoke of destiny. To his soldiers, he promised victory and glory. But privately, he confessed to his tutor that his real ambition was to erase the division between East and West, to create an empire that would outlast Rome itself. It was not just a siege he envisioned, it was a transformation of the world order. As winter turned to spring, messengers arrived from across Europe carrying rumors and warnings. The Turks are building cannons large enough to tear down mountains, they said. They will come for the Queen of Cities. But the Western kingdoms, divided by their own rivalries, did little. The Pope called for aid, but no army came. By the dawn of 1453, Constantinople stood alone, a city of perhaps 7,000 defenders facing an army 10 times its size. From the hills beyond the Bosphorus, the Ottoman banners unfurled. Mehmed, clad in steel and silk, mounted his horse and gave the command that would echo through centuries. "We will take this city, or this city will take us." The drums began to beat, rolling like thunder across the plains. Smoke from the cannons darkened the morning light. Behind him stretched a sea of soldiers, engineers, and artillerymen, the embodiment of his will. Ahead lay the walls that had defied empires. And at 19, Mehmed II, the boy they once mocked as a dreamer, was about to make history tremble. Dawn broke over the Bosphorus on April 6, 1453, with a silence that felt almost sacred. The sea glistened beneath the first rays of sunlight, the city's walls stood proud as they had for 1,000 years, and the Ottoman army stretched across the plain like an endless tide of steel. At their center, beneath a banner of red silk and crescent gold, stood Sultan Mehmed II, 19 years old, poised to make history. Before him rose Constantinople, the Queen of Cities, its massive double walls looming like the bones of an ancient god. Behind those stones waited Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, a man defending not just his city but the memory of an empire that had outlived Rome itself. The city's defenders numbered barely 7,000, including mercenaries, priests, and civilians pressed into service. Opposing them were over 80,000 Ottoman soldiers, a machine of conquest drawn from across the empire: Turks, Arabs, Kurds, Slavs, Albanians, and the elite Janissaries, the Sultan's most loyal warriors. It was not a battle of equals. It was a collision of centuries. Mehmed understood that victory began long before the first cannon fired. His siege was a masterclass in logistics and psychology. Supply lines were secured across Thrace. Bridges and roads were repaired to move heavy artillery. He ordered the great fortress Rumeil-i-Haiza, built the year before, to block any Christian fleet from reaching the city by sea. On land, he placed his main camp north of the Golden Horn. Engineers drove stakes into the muddy ground, measuring distances, building ramps, and preparing the massive cannons forged by Orban, the Hungarian engineer. The largest of these monsters, called Basilica, was made of bronze, 30 feet long, capable of hurling a 600-pound stone ball over a mile. When it fired, the earth itself shook. At dawn, Mehmed rode the perimeter of his army. The young Sultan's voice carried over the rumble of drums and the crackle of banners in the wind. "Brothers, this city has withstood 1,000 years of siege. But today, we are not merely warriors, we are history itself." Then he gave the order, "Begin." The first volley of cannon fire split the air. For the defenders, it was a sound like nothing they had ever heard, thunder made by man. For 53 days, the bombardment continued day and night. The rhythm became relentless. The deep boom of cannon, the crash of stone on stone, the roar of collapsing walls, and the echo of chants from both armies, "Allahu Akbar," from one side, "Kyrie eleison," from the other. The defenders, led by Giovanni Giustiniani, a seasoned Genoese commander, fought bravely. He organized counterfortifications, repaired breaches at night, and kept morale high. But Mehmed's artillery changed the nature of warfare. The ancient walls that had stopped Persians, Arabs, and Crusaders were now crumbling under mechanical firepower. Still, the Byzantines refused to surrender. They filled broken gaps with rubble and timber, turned monasteries into armories, and prayed under the trembling dome of Hagia Sophia. The sea had always been Constantinople's greatest defense. The Golden Horn, a narrow inlet, was sealed by a massive iron chain that stretched across its entrance, preventing Ottoman ships from entering. Mehmed's early naval attacks were repelled by Greek fire and the stubborn resistance of Venetian sailors. But the Sultan was nothing if not inventive. When direct assault failed, he turned to engineering genius. He ordered his ships, dozens of them, to be dragged over land. In one of history's boldest maneuvers, the Ottomans built wooden tracks greased with animal fat and rolled their ships over the hills behind Galata, launching them directly into the Golden Horn behind the Byzantine fleet. When the defenders awoke on April 22nd, they saw Ottoman sails inside their supposedly impenetrable harbour. The morale of Constantinople plummeted. Mehmed's voice carried through his camp. No wall can stop the will of a man who does not believe in limits. Now the siege was complete. The city was surrounded on all sides, by sea, by land, and by fear. Not all fighting was visible. Ottoman engineers began digging tunnels beneath the walls, hoping to collapse sections from below. The Byzantines countered by digging their own tunnels, guided by the echo of picks and shovels underground. In the darkness, men fought hand-to-hand by torchlight, steel flashing against stone and shadow. These battles beneath the earth symbolized the siege itself, a test of endurance, wits, and willpower. Above ground, corpses lined the trenches. Below, men fought unseen, driven by faith and desperation. By late May, Constantinople's defenders were exhausted. Food was running out, ammunition scarce, and the outer wall shattered. Yet the emperor refused to flee. "God has placed me here," Constantine declared, "and I will die with my people." Mehmed, meanwhile, grew restless. Each day without victory risked mutiny, disease, or intervention from Europe. So he changed his strategy, from attrition to overwhelming force. He called a council of war, and his commanders urged one last, decisive assault. The Sultan listened, then stood, his tone calm but absolute. "On the 29th day of May, we end this." Orders went out through the camp. Trumpets were tuned, drums redded. Every man was promised 3 days of plunder if the city fell. The Ottomans sharpened their blades. The Byzantines sharpened their prayers. Before dawn, the muezzins called the faithful to prayer across the Ottoman lines. A hush fell over the army. Then, at the Sultan's signal, the final attack began. Waves of troops surged toward the walls, irregulars first, then Anatolian soldiers, and finally the elite Janissaries. Cannons boomed in unison, breaking open the final breaches. Inside the city, Giustiniani was gravely wounded, and panic began to spread among the defenders. Constantine XI threw off his imperial regalia, taking up a sword to fight among his men. According to legend, his last words were, "The city is fallen, but I still live." Moments later, he vanished into the chaos, never to be seen again. When the Ottoman flag rose over the city walls, the sound that followed was not cheer, but silence, the stunned stillness of 1,000 years ending in a single breath. At midday, Mehmed rode through the shattered gates of Constantinople. Dust and smoke still hung in the air. He dismounted near Hagia Sophia, now crowded with captives praying for mercy. Entering the vast cathedral, he gazed up at the dome, sunlight streaming through broken windows, and whispered, "There is no God but God." Then he ordered that the church be preserved and converted into a mosque. To his soldiers, he commanded restraint. "Do not destroy what shall be ours forever," he said. For centuries, chroniclers would debate whether he was moved by piety, triumph, or the heavy realization of what he had done. But in that moment, Mehmed stood as both conqueror and inheritor, the man who ended one empire and began another. The city's name would change, Istanbul, but its meaning in the world would not. It remained the bridge between continents, faiths, and civilizations. The fall of Constantinople was more than a military victory. It was a transformation of history. It marked the end of the medieval world and the dawn of the modern age. Trade routes shifted, scholars fled west carrying ancient texts that would ignite the Renaissance, and the Ottoman Empire rose as the new center of power between Europe and Asia. Mehmed was hailed as the conqueror of two worlds. To his people, he was the fulfiller of prophecy. To Europe, he was a storm on the horizon. But even his enemies could not deny his genius. The siege had proved that walls, no matter how old or holy, could no longer stand against gunpowder, mathematics, and the mind of a man who refused to accept impossibility. In just 53 days, Mehmed II had done what 10 centuries of armies could not. He had ended an empire, and begun one that would last for nearly 500 years. When the dust settled over Constantinople, the world seemed to pause. The city that had stood for a millennium as the heart of Christendom now echoed with the footsteps of Ottoman soldiers and the sound of prayers in a new language. The world had changed, and so had Mehmed II. At 19, he had achieved what countless emperors, crusaders, and sultans had only dreamed of. But conquest was only the beginning. What came after, the building of empire, the control of people, and the survival of power, would demand a colder kind of genius. When Mehmed rode through the gates of Constantinople, his horses' hooves clattered over stones soaked in history. He halted before the great Hagia Sophia, the church that had crowned emperors for centuries. Its vast dome, still standing amid ruin, reflected sunlight through a haze of smoke. The young sultan dismounted, scooped a handful of earth, and let it fall from his hand, a gesture of humility before God and a statement to the world. "There is no God but God," he whispered, echoing across the empty space that would soon become a mosque. He ordered the building preserved, its walls repaired, and its Christian symbols covered, not destroyed. To Mehmed, this act was more than symbolism. It was policy. He wanted Constantinople not as a tomb of Byzantium but as the living heart of a new empire, one that would outlast the old. He renamed it Istanbul, derived from Isten Polen, to the city. It was a city reborn, destined to become the capital of an empire bridging two continents. Victory had elevated Mehmed from ambitious youth to mythic ruler, but it also left him with a new problem: how to rule an empire too large for one man's grasp. In the months after the conquest, he faced rebellions, conspiracies, and foreign intrigue. Christian kingdoms in the West saw him as an existential threat. Former Byzantine nobles plotted uprisings. Even within his court, the old aristocracy whispered doubts. Mehmed knew that empire could not rest on loyalty alone. It had to rest on fear and order. So he formalized the law of fratricide, the brutal Ottoman practice that allowed a sultan to kill his brothers to prevent civil war. It was not invention but codification, a public acknowledgement of what had long been done in shadows. The decree read, "Whichever of my sons inherits the throne, it behoves him to kill his brothers, for the good of the world order." It was horrifying in its clarity. But to Mehmed, it was logical. He had seen what dynastic struggle could do, how it tore empires apart. To him, mercy invited chaos. And so, from that day forward, Ottoman princes grew up knowing that love between brothers was temporary, and trust could be fatal. The empire's greatest strength, its absolute authority, was built on a foundation of fear. Among those who learned that lesson firsthand was Grand Vizier Sandal Halil Pasha, the powerful minister who had served Mehmed's father and opposed his plans to take Constantinople. For years, Halil had represented the conservative faction of the court, cautious and diplomatic. After the city's fall, Mehmed called him to the palace. The meeting was polite, ceremonial even. The Sultan praised Halil's long service, thanked him for his wisdom, and then, without warning, ordered his arrest. Days later, the vizier was executed by strangulation with a bowstring, his wealth confiscated, and his family stripped of all honors. It was not vengeance, it was message. To every noble, governor, and general across the empire, Mehmed had made it clear, no one was indispensable, and the old order had ended. His government was now staffed with men of merit, many from humble origins, soldiers, scholars, and administrators whose loyalty was to him alone. This was not just cruelty, it was modernization. Mehmed was replacing a feudal court with a centralized bureaucracy that answered only to the throne. Despite his reputation as a conqueror, Mehmed saw himself as more than a warrior. He was a builder, both of stone and of ideas. He ordered the construction of the Fodi Mosque complex, a monumental center that combined religion, education, and governance, symbolizing the unity of faith and state. Around it, he established madrasas, libraries, and schools that drew scholars from across the Muslim world. Greek philosophers, Persian poets, and Arab astronomers worked side by side under Ottoman patronage. In his private study, Mehmed collected manuscripts in multiple languages. He read Plato, Aristotle, Ptolemy, and the works of Islamic scholars like Ibn Sina. He spoke 5 languages fluently and corresponded with humanists from Renaissance Italy. To some European thinkers, the Sultan of the East seemed more enlightened than many Christian princes. Yet even in his curiosity, he remained a man of power. Learning, to him, was not for leisure but for dominion. Knowledge was another weapon, one that could strengthen his empire's foundations as surely as cannon and steel. Over the next decade, Mehmed expanded his realm through a combination of conquest and administration. He restructured the provinces, reformed the tax system, and created a professional civil service. His navy grew into one of the most formidable in the Mediterranean, rivaling Venice and Genoa. But everywhere his armies went, terror preceded them. Cities that resisted faced annihilation. Those that surrendered were absorbed into a carefully controlled system of tribute and autonomy. He perfected a dual method of rule, mercy for the obedient, devastation for the defiant. Entire populations were resettled to repopulate Istanbul and other key cities. Christians, Jews, and Muslims were granted relative freedom of worship, but always under the watchful eye of the Sultan's law. The message was simple. You may live, trade, and pray, so long as you remember who allows it. As years passed, Mehmed's paranoia deepened. The empire was stable, but he trusted no one completely. Even his own sons were not exempt from suspicion. When Prince Mustafa, one of his most gifted sons, grew popular among the Janissaries, rumors spread that he might attempt a coup. The young prince died suddenly, officially from illness, though few doubted the Sultan's hand. Mehmed's reign had begun with the drowning of an infant brother. It now continued with the quiet deaths of those closest to him. In the cold arithmetic of empire, affection had no place. By his 40s, Mehmed had become both feared and admired across 3 continents. In Europe, he was the terror of Christendom. In his own empire, he was the shadow of God on earth. He standardized legal codes, curbed corruption, and promoted meritocracy, reforms that would allow the Ottoman state to survive for centuries. Yet he also institutionalized brutality as a tool of governance. His reign was a paradox, enlightenment built on blood, progress enforced by fear. He saw no contradiction in this. To him, the empire was a living organism, and sometimes, to preserve life, one must amputate. By the time Mehmed II died in 1481, at just 49, his empire stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates. He had turned a sultanate into a superpower and a city into a capital of the world. But his true legacy was psychological. He had taught generations of rulers that power and mercy could not coexist, that stability demanded sacrifice. His successors would inherit both his empire and his paranoia. Historians would argue for centuries. Was he a tyrant or a visionary? A destroyer or a founder? Perhaps he was both, the necessary contradiction of his age. Because Mehmed understood what few rulers ever truly grasp, that history remembers victory, not virtue. And in the shadow of his reign, the Ottoman Empire would rise, vast, enduring, and haunted by the price of its own greatness. The empire that Mehmed II built from fire and ambition was now a force the world could not ignore. From the Danube to the deserts of Anatolia, the Ottoman crescent rose above lands that had once bowed to Rome and Byzantium. Yet for the Sultan who had conquered the unconquerable, peace was not a reward, it was a test. Because the same brilliance that had brought him power also denied him rest. The boy who dreamed of Constantinople had become the man who dreamed of the world. After 1453, the Sultan turned his eyes westward. The Mediterranean, once dominated by Venice and Genoa, now shimmered with opportunity and threat. Trade routes, islands, fortresses, all were veins of power that fed Europe's wealth. Mehmed understood that whoever controlled the sea controlled history. He ordered the construction of an imperial fleet, recruiting shipwrights from Greece and Syria, sailors from North Africa, and artillery masters from Hungary. The docks of Gallipoli thundered with the sound of hammers and saws as ships rose from wood and steel. Within a few years, the Ottoman navy rivaled the Italian republics that had once ruled the waves. Venice watched uneasily. Its merchants depended on eastern trade. Its senators knew that war with the Sultan meant economic ruin. But fear alone could not buy peace. In 1463, the fragile truce shattered, and the Ottoman-Venetian War began. The campaign was brutal and slow. Fortress after fortress fell: Argos, Negroponte, Bosnia. The seas burned with naval battles, and cities that had prospered for centuries were reduced to ash. But behind every victory, Mehmed's purpose remained clear: to make the Ottoman Empire not only the conqueror of lands but the master of routes. Venice would survive, but never again as the unchallenged queen of the Mediterranean. The balance of power had shifted, forever. While his admirals fought the Venetians, Mehmed faced a darker challenge on land. To the north, in the forests of Wallachia, ruled a man whose name would become legend, Vlad III, known to history as Vlad the Impaler or Dracula. A former ally, Vlad had once served the Sultan's cause, even spending part of his youth in Ottoman custody. But power twists loyalty, and when Vlad returned to rule his homeland, he defied the empire that had once sheltered him. He refused tribute, ambushed Ottoman envoys, and impaled their bodies along the Danube as a message. Mehmed's response was swift. In 1462, he marched north with an army of over 100,000 men, a massive force for the time. Yet what awaited him was not war, but nightmare. As the army entered Wallachia, they found villages abandoned, wells poisoned, bridges destroyed. And then, in a clearing near Targovite, they came upon a forest of death. Thousands of impaled bodies, Ottoman soldiers, peasants, even animals, all left to rot in grotesque display. The sight shook even hardened veterans. Chroniclers wrote that Mehmed paused, saying quietly, "How can one man inspire such terror, even in death?" But terror alone could not defeat the empire. Vlad's guerrilla tactics delayed the Ottomans but could not stop them. His allies abandoned him. His people turned against him. Within months, Wallachia fell, and Vlad fled into exile, his throne gone, his legend immortal. To Europe, he was a hero who resisted the Sultan's tide. To Mehmed, he was a symptom, proof that fear could both rule and consume. Despite constant campaigns, Mehmed never ceased to study. His tent was a library as much as a command post. He carried works of Plutarch, Herodotus, and Aristotle, reading between battles and annotating margins in his own hand. He debated theologians, corresponded with Italian humanists, and welcomed scholars from Persia and Egypt. Yet knowledge, to Mehmed, was always tactical. When he studied the Romans, it was to learn their logistics. When he read Aristotle, it was to understand control. He saw empire not as divine chance but as a system, something that could be engineered, managed, and perpetuated. In this, he was centuries ahead of his time. To his subjects, he presented himself as Padishah, the shadow of God on earth. But privately, he viewed himself as an architect, shaping men and laws as carefully as he had shaped the cannon that broke Constantinople. Still, for all his intellect, he remained haunted by what he had created. As one Venetian envoy later wrote, "He fears no man, yet he is prisoner to his own ambition." By the 1470s, the name Mehmed the Conqueror echoed through Europe like thunder. Monarchs who had once ignored the Turkish problem now built alliances and coastal defenses. Pope Sixtus IV called for new crusades, Hungary fortified its borders, Italy prayed behind its marble walls. In 1470, Mehmed seized Euboea, Negroponte, from Venice, turning the Aegean into an Ottoman sea. In 1475, his forces clashed with the Crimean Tatars and the Genos in the Black Sea. He began eyeing Italy itself, not as rumour, but as plan. In 1480, the impossible happened. An Ottoman army landed on the Italian peninsula. The fortress city of Otranto, in southern Italy, fell after a brutal siege. It was a shock that rippled through Europe. For the first time, Ottoman soldiers stood on Latin soil. Mehmed's message was unmistakable. Rome fell once before. It can fall again. Though the occupation was short-lived, Lasting less than a year, it transformed the European psyche. The fear of the Turk at the gates would define politics, art, and religion for generations. In the spring of 1481, Mehmed set out on what would be his final campaign. No one knew his target. Some said Rhodes, others whispered Italy again. He travelled with a massive force, crossing into Anatolia. But near the small town of Maltepe, his health suddenly collapsed. For days he lay in his tent, feverish and silent. Physicians came and went, none daring to pronounce the truth. Outside, the army waited for orders that would never come. On May 3, 1481, Mehmed II, the conqueror, the lawgiver, the shadow that stretched across 2 continents, was dead. He was 49. When word reached his troops, a hush spread through the camp. Some wept. Others simply looked east, uncertain whether the world had changed again. In Istanbul, his body was carried through the same gates he had once stormed as a boy. Mourners lined the streets. Imams recited verses, priests looked on in silence, and even his rivals admitted a chapter of history had closed. The West would remember Mehmed in fear and fascination. To Renaissance writers, he was both Antichrist and Alexander, a destroyer who also admired philosophy and art. Painters depicted him surrounded by scholars. Priests cursed his name in sermons. Yet even his enemies could not escape his influence. The fall of Constantinople had driven Greek scholars into Italy, fueling the very Renaissance that would redefine Europe. The printing press spread news of his victories across the continent, forcing kings to modernize their armies and rethink faith's role in politics. In a strange irony, Mehmed had not just conquered Europe's walls, he had helped ignite its rebirth. To the Ottomans, he remained the eternal example, ruthless yet visionary, feared yet revered. His tomb in Istanbul, beneath the Fodi Mosque, became a place of pilgrimage, not for worship, but for reflection. On the walls above his sarcophagus, an inscription reads, "He conquered the city of the Caesars and gave it to Islam." But time, indifferent to empires, carried his story beyond creed. Because in truth, Mehmed II was neither saint nor monster, but the inevitable product of an age where the old world was dying and a new one was being born. His sword carved the borders of that transformation. His mind ensured that it would endure. And his shadow, stretching across east and west, still lingers, a reminder that power, once seized, always demands its price. When Mehmed II died in the spring of 1481, the empire he had forged seemed invincible. His armies had conquered the greatest city in the world. His laws had turned chaos into order. His name, whispered across continents, inspired both awe and dread. Yet even as the Sultan's body cooled beneath the silks of his tent near Maltepe, the empire he left behind trembled with uncertainty. Because for all his brilliance, Mehmed had built a throne that only fear could hold together. And fear, as history would soon prove, dies faster than it is born. The announcement of Mehmed's death struck his army like a thunderclap. No one had been prepared for it, not his generals, not his viziers, not even his sons. 2 heirs immediately emerged, Bayezid, the older, cautious and pious, and Jem, the younger, ambitious and restless. Both knew that in the Ottoman Empire, a sultan's death was not a moment of mourning, it was a race for survival. Bayezid was in Amasya, far from the capital. Jem was in Konya, closer to the power centers of Anatolia. The 2 brothers moved swiftly, summoning allies, promising gold, loyalty, or mercy. But there could be only one ruler, for Mehmed himself had written the law that made it so. "Whichever of my sons attains the throne," his edict read, "it behoves him to kill his brothers in the interest of world order." Within days, Constantinople became a city divided. Janissaries filled the streets, their allegiance uncertain. The treasury sealed itself. The palace courtiers waited in silence for a signal. And in that vacuum, the empire Mehmed had ruled by absolute command discovered its most dangerous truth. Without his voice, there was no center. Jem struck first. He gathered loyal troops in Anatolia and proclaimed himself sultan. But Bayezid, though slower to move, had the loyalty of the capital's janissaries, men who had served Mehmed for decades and would accept no ruler who could not guarantee order. The 2 armies clashed near Yenisehir in a short but decisive battle. Jem fought bravely but lacked numbers. His forces broke, and he fled west, seeking refuge first with the Mamluks of Egypt, then, fatefully, with the Knights of Rhodes, a Christian military order sworn to fight the Ottomans. The irony was brutal. The son of the Conqueror of Constantinople now begged sanctuary from the very crusaders his father had spent a lifetime defeating. Cem's story became one of the strangest in Ottoman history. The knights promised him protection but soon realized the value of their guest. They turned him into a bargaining chip, a prince whose mere existence could destabilize the empire. Over the next decade, Cem was moved between Rhodes, France, and Italy, treated as both prisoner and prize, courted by popes and kings who dreamed of using him as leverage against his brother's empire. Bayezid, meanwhile, ruled from Istanbul with quiet calculation. He paid the knights a yearly tribute to ensure Cem remained their captive, the ultimate ransom not for freedom, but for silence. When Cem finally died in 1495, likely poisoned under the shadow of a papal palace in Naples, his body was returned to Ottoman soil. His death ended the last internal threat to Bayezid's rule but also symbolized something larger, the beginning of a colder, more bureaucratic empire. Where his father had been thunder, Bayezid was mist. Measured, patient, devout, he reigned not by force of personality but by restoring balance to an empire exhausted by conquest. He reduced taxes, repaired infrastructure, and invited scholars and poets to his court. The Fodi Mosque complex, built by his father, became a center of learning where jurists debated law, astronomers studied the stars, and theologians sought harmony between reason and faith. Yet even in peace, Mehmed's shadow lingered. The Janissaries still spoke his name in reverence. The people still whispered his decrees as divine law. And Bayezid, despite his piety, governed through the same machinery of fear his father had perfected. He inherited not just an empire, but a psychology, the belief that authority was inseparable from control, and mercy was a luxury of the weak. Still, Bayezid's reign introduced a different kind of strength, one of diplomacy and stability. He established treaties with Venice, reopened trade with Genoa, and even offered asylum to the Jews expelled from Spain in 1492, declaring, "They say Ferdinand is a wise king, yet he impoverishes his country and enriches mine." In that moment, the Ottoman Empire, born from the ashes of conquest, became one of the most cosmopolitan powers of its age. In Christian Europe, Mehmed's death had been greeted with relief bordering on celebration. Priests preached that divine justice had struck down the scourge of Christendom. Bells rang in Venice and Rome. Yet beneath the jubilation was unease. The Ottomans had not collapsed as many hoped, they had stabilized. Bayezid's envoys negotiated with popes and princes, offering peace treaties that carried the same weight as papal bulls. European merchants returned cautiously to Istanbul's markets, drawn by profit that outweighed piety. But Europe's nightmares did not fade. In paintings and sermons, Mehmed remained the face of terror, the man who broke Rome's heir. His siege of Constantinople was retold not as history but as warning. And as explorers like Columbus and Vasco da Gama set sail, many did so with Ottoman power in mind, seeking routes that would bypass the empire's grip on trade between East and West. Thus, in a twist of fate, Mehmed's walls around Constantinople indirectly pushed Europe to the seas, and into the age of discovery. Even in death, Mehmed's presence haunted those who succeeded him. Bayezid too built schools, but they stood on foundations laid by conquest. He preached justice, but he ruled through laws written in the blood of his father's rivals. Over time, the empire evolved into something Mehmed himself might barely have recognized, a machine of administration, commerce, and faith, vast but disciplined. Yet the ghost of its founder remained embedded in every decision. 4 centuries after, whenever a sultan faced rebellion, scholars quoted Mehmed's decree on fratricide. Whenever a general hesitated before battle, they invoke his words at Constantinople, "The city is ours or we are theirs." He had become myth, not just a ruler of men, but a blueprint for power itself. Today, historians still wrestle with Mehmed's dual legacy. Was he the architect of progress, the man who ended the medieval world and ushered in the modern age? Or was he the embodiment of tyranny, a ruler who proved that civilization could be built on calculated cruelty? The truth, as always, lies in between. He was both the hammer and the hand that shaped the new world. His empire preserved ancient learning while erasing ancient cultures. His vision united continents but divided faiths. Even his greatest victory, the fall of Constantinople, stands as both triumph and tragedy, the end of one civilization, the dawn of another. And as the centuries passed, Mehmed's story became less about religion or empire and more about the timeless human paradox, that greatness and horror often walk the same path. When visitors stand today beneath the dome of the Fodi Mosque, sunlight filtering through Ottoman arches that once replaced Byzantine ones, they are standing on history's crossroads. They can feel the weight of a ruler who conquered not just a city, but time itself. a man whose empire shaped the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the world that followed. For every empire that rose after his, Spanish, British, French, carried a fragment of his legacy. The understanding that to command the future, one must first master fear. When Sultan Mehmed II died, his empire did not die with him. It breathed, evolved, and reshaped itself, carrying his shadow through the centuries. The stones he laid in Constantinople, the laws he signed, and the fear he inspired all became the foundations of a civilization that outlived him by almost half a millennium. This is the story of what came after the Conqueror, how his vision outlasted his life, transforming a city of ruins into the beating heart of empires, and eventually, into the modern world we know today. In the days following the conquest of 1453, Constantinople was a graveyard of silence. Smoke still hung over its domes, streets were littered with debris, and the once great capital of Christendom stood half empty, broken but not dead. Mehmed II had not destroyed the city to erase it. He had destroyed it to rebuild it. He declared it the new capital of his empire, renaming it not overnight, but by destiny, Istanbul, derived from the Greek phrase "Ist in Poland," meaning to the city. He ordered the reconstruction of markets, aqueducts, and mosques. Churches were converted or rebuilt. Scholars, artisans, and merchants were invited from every corner of his domains to repopulate the capital. Within a decade, the once deserted Byzantine city had become a vibrant, multicultural metropolis. Arabic, Persian, Greek, Armenian, and Turkish mingling in its narrow streets. Mehmed's goal was not merely conquest, it was transformation. He envisioned a capital that reflected the unity of empire, where Islam would reign, but knowledge and commerce would thrive beyond faith. The Grand Bazaar emerged during his reign, not as a place of luxury but of survival, a network of traders who would anchor the economy of the empire. The call to prayer rose from newly built minarets, and across the Golden Horn, ships from Venice, Alexandria, and Crimea continued to dock. From the ashes of Byzantium, a new Rome had indeed been born, but one that looked east as much as west. What Mehmed began as a project of empire soon became a project of civilization. He established schools, madrasas, attached to every major mosque, where students studied mathematics, astronomy, theology, and law. He brought Greek and Persian texts into translation, sponsoring libraries and scholars. Ironically, while much of Europe still struggled with religious censorship, the Ottoman court became a hub for classical learning. From his encouragement of architecture to his fascination with cartography, Mehmed's court blended war and intellect in a way the medieval world had rarely seen. The Fodi Mosque complex, his most enduring architectural legacy, was designed not only as a place of worship but as an institution, combining a mosque, hospital, school, library, and kitchen for the poor. It was empire as infrastructure, faith as administration. Over the next century, his successors built upon this blueprint. Suleiman the Magnificent, born 2 generations later, expanded the empire's reach, but the foundations of his greatness, the bureaucracy, the military system, the city itself, were all Mehmed's creations. Under these rulers, Istanbul became more than the Ottoman capital. It became the cultural heart of the Islamic world, a city where Persian poets, Greek astronomers, and Arab theologians debated philosophy beneath the same domes that had once echoed Byzantine chants. But Mehmed's most lasting legacy was not architectural, it was psychological. His doctrine of absolute authority, codified through the law of fratricide, ensured the empire would never fall to internal chaos, but it also ensured that fear became a tool of governance. For centuries, every Ottoman prince would live under the shadow of that law, growing up in gilded cages, knowing that succession meant survival, and mercy could mean death. This culture of control extended far beyond the palace. Governors ruled provinces under constant surveillance, janissaries enforced order with loyalty and terror in equal measure, and the bureaucracy became an iron web, efficient but merciless. And yet, paradoxically, this same discipline allowed the empire to endure through wars, plagues, and revolts that destroyed kingdoms around it. Where European thrones changed hands through marriage or revolt, the Ottoman throne survived through fear and faith, twin pillars first carved by Mehmed's will. Across the sea, Europe continued to live in Mehmed's shadow. The fall of Constantinople had shattered medieval confidence. The walls that had protected Christendom for 1,000 years had fallen, and with them, the illusion of divine permanence. In response, Europe changed. The flight of Byzantine scholars westward fueled the Renaissance, carrying Greek philosophy and knowledge into Italy. The rise of humanism, science, and exploration, all accelerated by that single event in 1453. Even as European nations rose in power, they defined themselves in opposition to Mehmed's empire. His name became a symbol. To the west, the Turk was both enemy and mirror, a reflection of what they feared becoming and what they secretly admired. The Age of Discovery, too, was born from this paradox. By closing the old Silk Road through Ottoman dominance, Mehmed had forced explorers like Columbus and Da Gama to search for new routes, and in doing so, he inadvertently set the stage for the global age. The conqueror who dreamed of uniting continents had, in a way, accomplished it, though not as he imagined. Centuries passed. The Ottoman Empire rose and declined. Palaces expanded, revolutions came and went, and yet Istanbul remained, the living proof of Mehmed's transformation. Under the Tanzimat reforms of the 19th century, the empire modernized. New schools, telegraphs, railways. Western diplomats marveled at the city that still balanced two worlds, the call to prayer rising beside church bells, caravans unloading silks beside European steamships. Even after the fall of the empire in 1922, when Mustafa Kemal Ataturk proclaimed the Republic of Turkey, Istanbul, though no longer the capital, remained its soul. Modern skyscrapers rose beside ancient mosques. Streetcars passed beneath the same aqueducts Mehmed had restored. The Hagia Sophia, once church, then mosque, then museum, stood as an eternal metaphor, a building reborn with every age, just like the city itself. But beyond history's grandeur lies a deeper truth. Mehmed's story, of youth, genius, brutality, and ambition, speaks to the duality of all human empires. His brilliance built bridges between civilizations, yet his methods left scars that still echo in the world's memory. To modern Istanbul, his name evokes both pride and unease. Pride, for the vision that turned ruins into empire. Unease, for the blood that bought it. In the streets of Fodi today, the district that bears his name, one can still walk from the ruins of a Byzantine church to the courtyard of an Ottoman mosque in minutes, a journey through centuries compressed into a few city blocks. Children playing near fountains built by his architects. Merchants sell spices where his soldiers once marched. The empire has faded, but the rhythm remains. Because in Istanbul, history does not sleep, it breathes. Standing beneath the great dome of the Fodi Mosque, one can still sense what Mehmed believed, that destiny is not inherited, it is built. He was neither saint nor monster, but something rarer, a man who understood history as an instrument and played it with terrifying skill. From the fall of Constantinople to the rise of global trade, from the Renaissance to modern Turkey, his shadow has touched every chapter that followed. The stones of Istanbul still whisper his legacy, not in the language of conquest, but in the quiet endurance of a city that refuses to die. Because in the end, Mehmed's true empire was not land or gold. It was continuity, the power to endure, to rebuild, to remain. And that, perhaps, is the greatest conquest of all. When Sultan Mehmed II died, he left behind more than an empire, he left behind a question. Was he a visionary who fulfilled destiny, or a tyrant who bent faith and fear to his will? That question has haunted history for 5 centuries, dividing how the world remembers him, as a hero of Islam or as the scourge of Christendom. His empire may have fallen long ago, but his image never did. It lives on in the paintings of Renaissance Europe, in the minarets of Istanbul, and in the myths that both glorify and condemn him. And to this day, the face of Mehmed II remains a mirror, reflecting what each civilization most fears and most admires in power. To medieval Europe, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 was not just a political event, it was an apocalypse. For over 1,000 years, the city had been the last stronghold of the Christian East, the seat of the Roman legacy, and a symbol of divine order. When it fell, Europe felt the ground shift beneath its feet. Church bells rang in mourning from Rome to Paris. Pope Nicholas V called for a crusade that never came. Chroniclers compared Mehmed to Attila, Nero, even the Antichrist himself. In sermons and paintings, he became the embodiment of the infidel conqueror. Artists depicted him surrounded by flames or seated on a throne of skulls, the destroyer of the faith. But over time, the image evolved. As centuries passed and the Renaissance dawned, Europe's perception of Mehmed began to change from horror to fascination. The Venetians, once his fiercest enemies, began trading again with the Ottomans. Italian artists, pragmatic and curious, saw in Mehmed not a demon, but a fellow patron of art and intellect. In 1479, the famous Venetian painter Gentile Bellini travelled to Istanbul at Mehmed's request. There, he painted the Sultan's portrait, a groundbreaking image that remains one of the most iconic depictions of an Islamic ruler in Western art. The portrait showed not a barbarian, but a philosopher king, calm, elegant, introspective. Bellini surrounded Mehmed with arches modelled after Roman triumphal gates, a visual acknowledgement that the new Caesar had arrived. This single painting quietly changed Europe's relationship with the man it once feared. Through Bellini's eyes, Mehmed became not merely the Turk, but a Renaissance figure, educated, cultured, and ruthlessly brilliant. By the 17th century, European historians began writing about him with reluctant admiration. Edward Gibbon, in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, called him the greatest of the Ottoman princes. Thus, the conqueror who had once symbolized the end of Christian civilization became, in Western memory, a paradox, a monster who built bridges, a villain who understood beauty. In the Islamic world, Mehmed's story carried a different tone, not fear, but fulfillment. To his people, he was Mehmed al-Fti, the conqueror, the ruler who fulfilled the Prophet Muhammad's prophecy. Verily, Constantinople shall be conquered. What a wonderful commander will her commander be. This belief transformed Mehmed into more than a king. He became a chosen instrument of divine history. 4 centuries after his death, poets, clerics, and historians across the Muslim world celebrated him as a hero of faith and empire. Mosques bore his name, schools were built in his honor, and sermons invoke his victories as proof that God favored the Ottomans. In the 16th century, under Suleiman the Magnificent, Mehmed's legend became official imperial identity. The Ottoman sultans referred to themselves as the heirs of the conqueror, invoking his memory whenever they launched a new campaign. His military reforms, the use of cannons, the codified law, the centralized bureaucracy, became sacred templates for rule. Yet even within Islamic history, the image of Mehmed was not one-dimensional. While his conquest of Constantinople was seen as holy, his ruthless enforcement of power, the execution of viziers, the codified fratricide law, raised moral debates among scholars. Was such brutality justified by divine purpose? Was it the price of stability, or a betrayal of mercy? These questions echoed through Ottoman intellectual circles for generations. For theologians, Mehmed was a test of faith's intersection with pragmatism, proof that even a God-favored ruler must wield both justice and cruelty to maintain order. By the 19th century, as the empire began to weaken, his memory gained a new role. He became a symbol of lost glory, invoked by reformers who sought to modernize the state while reclaiming its soul. His image was painted on banners during military parades and printed in patriotic newspapers during the decline of Ottoman power. To Muslims across the world, especially in the age of colonialism, Mehmed II stood as a reminder that the Islamic world had once conquered, not been conquered. Today, the memory of Mehmed II stands divided, but alive. In Turkey, he is a national icon. Streets, schools, and mosques bear his name. The Fodi district in Istanbul, where his great mosque still stands, is both a place of worship and pilgrimage, not of religion, but of identity. Each May 29th, the anniversary of the conquest of Constantinople, fireworks light the Bosphorus, and people gather along the ancient walls to celebrate Fethi Günü, Conquest Day. Children wave flags, soldiers reenact the siege, and scholars recite verses honoring the Sultan who changed the world. But even among modern Turks, his image sparks debate. Some view him as the father of national pride, the man who united Anatolia and gave birth to Istanbul's greatness. Others question the cost of that greatness, the bloodshed, the fear, the intolerance that sometimes accompanied his vision. In Europe, Mehmed's legacy has shifted once again, from villain to enigma. Historians now study his empire-building strategies, his early embrace of artillery technology, and his philosophical curiosity. He is taught alongside figures like Alexander, Caesar, and Napoleon, conquerors whose ambitions transcended geography. Even in pop culture, his image endures, portrayed in films, novels, and documentaries not as a one-note tyrant, but as a man who reshaped civilizations. In truth, Mehmed II belongs to neither East nor West, and to both. He was a product of his time, yet ahead of it. A ruler of faith who admired Aristotle. A warrior who corresponded with Italian humanists. A visionary who rebuilt the city he conquered. That duality is his essence, and his curse. The East claims his faith. The West claims his intellect. But both claim his greatness. Standing today beneath the dome of the Hagia Sophia, which he transformed from cathedral to mosque, one can feel that paradox still alive. The building itself is neither fully Christian nor Muslim, but both. Its stones whisper in 2 languages, its light falls on two histories. Just like its conqueror. If Mehmed could look upon the modern world, he might recognize himself in it. In the ambition of nations, in the bridges between continents, in the conflicts between faith and reason. Because in the end, Mehmed II was not just a man of the 15th century, he was a symbol of what humanity becomes when it seeks to master destiny. To the east, he remains the sword of faith. To the west, the architect of change. And between them, somewhere in the silence of history, lives the truth of who he was. Neither saint nor monster, but the man who taught the world that every empire, every ideal, and every faith carries both light and shadow. And that, perhaps, is why his legend endures. When Sultan Mehmed II died in 1481, his body was lowered into the marble tomb within the Fodi Mosque, but his presence never left the world he had conquered. Empires have borders, legacies do not. More than 5 centuries later, Mehmed's shadow still stretches across continents, politics, and faiths. His name evokes pride and unease, heroism and terror, depending on who speaks it. To some, he is the man who fulfilled divine prophecy. To others, the tyrant who extinguished the last light of Rome. But to history itself, Mehmed II remains something more complex, the first ruler of the modern world. Mehmed II did not merely conquer cities, he reinvented empire. Long before the concept of nation-state emerged in Europe, he created a centralized administrative system based on merit, law, and surveillance. He reorganized the Ottoman court, blending Islamic governance with Byzantine bureaucracy, creating a hybrid structure that would endure for centuries. Every province reported directly to Istanbul. Governors were rotated to prevent loyalty from overpowering authority. Taxes were recorded, soldiers were paid in land grants, and communication flowed through a hierarchy that anticipated the modern state. This model, an empire run through discipline rather than lineage, later inspired European powers. Historians have noted that the administrative systems of Austria-Hungary, Russia, and even France under Napoleon borrowed from Ottoman precedents. The West learned from the man it once called a barbarian. In that sense, Mehmed's conquest of Constantinople was not just military, it was ideological. It proved that organization could defeat heritage, that a young, dynamic system could outlast empires built on nostalgia. It is easy to see Mehmed as a man of war, but his truest weapon was culture. By transforming Constantinople into Istanbul, he turned geography into diplomacy. His empire became the meeting point of East and West, Islam and Christianity, Asia and Europe. He invited scholars, artists, and architects from Persia, Greece, Italy, and Egypt to his court. The result was a fusion unseen before. Persian miniature artistry blended with Byzantine mosaics, Arabic calligraphy adorned Greek domes. Trade flowed through the Bosphorus like blood through arteries. Venetian merchants, Arab traders, and Balkan farmers all shared the same city. Istanbul became the first global capital, centuries before London or Paris claimed that title. This fusion extended beyond art. It shaped cuisine, language, and architecture. Coffee from Yemen met sugar from the Mediterranean. Turkish words slipped into Slavic dialects. Arabic idioms crept into Balkan poetry. Even today, Istanbul's skyline, domes, spires, and minarets, tells the story of a civilization that refused to choose between East and West. If Mehmed's rule was defined by conquest, his afterlife has been defined by revival. Every generation that faced a crisis, Ottoman, Turkish, or global, has found a different Mehmed to resurrect. In the 19th century, as the Ottoman Empire declined, reformers invoked him as the symbol of lost greatness, the last ruler who embodied unity and strength. His portrait hung in schools and military academies. Poets called upon Fodi to awaken the empire from decay. In the 20th century, the newly formed Republic of Turkey tried to distance itself from its Ottoman past. Yet even then, Mehmed's name endured, stripped of its religious symbolism and reframed as a nationalist icon. He became the father of Turkish statehood, the man who had made the country's existence possible. In modern Turkey, his image continues to evolve. To secularists, he is a strategist, an innovator, the rational founder of empire. To conservatives, he is the warrior of faith, the hero who carried Islam to victory. To both, he remains indispensable, the embodiment of power, intellect, and identity. Every time the Hagia Sophia changes, from church to mosque, from museum to mosque again, Mehmed's ghost stirs. That building, like the man who claimed it, remains the stage upon which politics, religion, and memory collide. Beyond Turkey's borders, Mehmed's image continues to ripple through culture and geopolitics. In the Muslim world, he is remembered as the proof that prophecy can become reality. His conquest of Constantinople stands as the high-water mark of Islamic expansion, invoked by political leaders and movements seeking to restore lost strength. In Europe, his legacy is a cautionary tale turned fascination. The fear that once fueled crusades has transformed into admiration for Ottoman tolerance, architecture, and art. Museums display his coins and armor. Historians teach his siege tactics as the birth of modern warfare. In popular media, he has become a cinematic archetype, the enigmatic ruler who combines intellect and ruthlessness. Films, novels, and documentaries portray him not as villain or saint but as a man torn between prophecy and power. Yet the real legacy of Mehmed II lies in the balance between faith and reason, tradition and modernity, the same balance that defines global politics today. History remembers conquerors in absolutes, but Mehmed resists them. His empire united religions yet destroyed a civilization. He valued intellect but ruled through fear. He built schools and burned libraries. This paradox makes him timeless, because humanity still wrestles with the same questions he embodied. How far can ambition go before it becomes tyranny? Can greatness exist without cruelty? Can progress be born from conquest? Every modern superpower, in its rise and fall, has echoed those questions, from colonial Europe to the Cold War to the digital empires of today. Mehmed's story warns that dominance without conscience builds monuments, not peace. He proved that one man's will could change the world, but also that the world, once changed, could never return to innocence. Walk through Istanbul today, and Mehmed's fingerprints remain everywhere. The call to prayer from Fodi Mosque still rises at dawn. The Grand Bazaar still hums with trade. Across the Bosphorus, neon lights from skyscrapers reflect on waters once filled with war galleys. The same skyline that watched the cannons of 1453 now glows with satellites and glass towers, proof that cities, like empires, never truly die. They transform. Tourists stand before the Hagia Sophia in quiet awe. Some see a symbol of faith, others a museum of human endurance. In its layered stones lies Mehmed's greatest achievement, not domination, but continuity. He conquered a city to ensure civilization itself would not collapse, and in doing so, built one of the few metropolises that bridges not just continents, but eras. In the end, Mehmed II's legacy is not about conquest, it is about transformation. He took what was divided and made it whole, what was ancient and made it new. His empire has vanished, but his idea, the fusion of power and intellect, east and west, tradition and progress, remains alive in the world's greatest cities, from Istanbul to New York, from Rome to Cairo. He once said, "To command the world, you must first command yourself." That was his secret, discipline as destiny. 500 years later, his tomb still draws visitors. Some come to honor him, others to question him. But all leave changed, because to stand before the grave of Mehmed the Conqueror is to stand before the question that defines humanity itself. Can we build greatness without destruction? And can the future ever escape the shadows of the past? Perhaps that is why his story still endures. Because the world he remade is still learning how to live within it.